Bill Gates believed in his individual talents over that of a team until this happened. As a teenager, Gates thought genius was enough. He wrote entire systems alone, from a class scheduler at the age of 16 to a traffic startup. But at TRW, working on the Northwest power grid, his code came back covered in blue ink. The reviewer? John Norton, a NASA engineer whose last project, Mariner 1, was destroyed minutes after launch, caused by a missing hyphen in code he oversaw. Gates' reaction? Oh wow, this guy is so right. That critique was a turning point. Gates realized brilliance alone had limits, and he began chasing not solo perfection, but team perfection. As he later said,
"First I wrote all the code, then eventually there was code that I didn't look at or people that I didn't hire."
And here's why it matters. Gates made the same shift every new manager must make. I'll show you the exact turning points from Gates' memoir source code and how they map to the leadership shift you need to make, from doing everything yourself to building teams that achieve far more together. Let's get into it. It was 1968. Gates was a 13-year-old student at Lakeside High School in North Seattle. An enterprising teacher named Bill Dougal took a computing class and thought he should get computer access at the school. Now, computers are mostly in universities and government projects then. They weren't in homes. So the access they built at the school was remote on an early version of the internet, 1968. The students typed on a teletype called ASR33, which is actually bought by the Lakeside Mothers Group from the funds from their annual rummage sale. The young Gates started learning how to code, and he got so good. He got his first gig that same year. He built his school's class scheduling system over a summer. But it was a difficult project, and it almost didn't work. But they figured it out right at the end of the summer, and they got hired again to improve the first iteration. He and his friend Paul Allen soon got access to a $1 million computer called a PDP-10 at a place called the Computer Center Corporation in downtown Seattle, where they were actually paid to find bugs in software. Now, this experience of the PDP-10 would be essential to their eventual founding of Microsoft. Next, Bill started his first company, still in high school. You see those rubber tubes running across the road? When a wheel runs over them, it creates a puff of air at the end of the hose, which is used to count cars. Today, those tubes send data straight into computers, but in the early 70s, they punched holes into paper tape. It worked, but the problem was turning that paper tape information back into man-readable data. It was a tedious manual process. So when Gates was 17, he co-founded a company called Trafodata with Paul Allen and an electrical engineering student at the University of Washington named Paul Gilbert. Together, they actually built a machine that could read those paper tapes. If you're watching on YouTube, here's a clip of it. So it would read those paper tapes and automatically translate them into reports, saving engineers countless of hours. And it worked, sort of. When the representative from King County came in to see the machine, it broke. Hardware is hard. Then Bill got his first real taste of a complex system. He took time off his senior year in high school to work for TRW, building a computer system that would help run the Northwest power grid. He wasn't yet 18, and he was amazed by what he saw. When he first got to the job site, it was a futuristic scene. It was filled with PDP-10s. He compared it to the control room from his favorite TV show called The Time Tunnel. As he describes it in the book, he says a wall-sized screen tracked the state of the power grid and every dam and power facility in the entire Northwest. There were rows and rows of computer terminals with color graphic screens. Now, this project is aimed at automating the balancing of power supply from hydroelectric dams and coal power plants and the fluctuating demand from millions of homes. And here's the thing, they were only allowed 5.5 minutes of downtime per year. Gates looked at that and said, nothing I'd ever worked on required such near perfection. I thought they were joking. Now, up until that point, Gates thought invention was the work of a lone genius and that he was that genius. But now he's part of this huge team and the margin for error is very slim. And it was here that he met John Norton. Now, Norton was an engineer twice his age, already marked by one of NASA's most painful failures. He'd worked on a spacecraft called Mariner 1. Mariner 1 was to travel to Venus and record data about its atmosphere, but just minutes after launch, NASA engineers had to press the self-destruct button because of errors in its guidance system, and an $18 million spacecraft was destroyed. Now, the cause of this guidance system failure? There was a missing hyphen in some software code. Software code John Norton had supervised. Norton was so affected by this, he carried a newspaper clipping of the failure in his wallet, neatly folded like origami. It was a constant reminder of accountability, and he had steeled this resolve into writing perfect code on high complexity, high consequence systems like this power grid project. So one morning, Gates came into TRW to find a printout of code he had written on his desk, and it was covered in blue ink. His code had been completely torn apart by Norton. Norton gave feedback on the entire structure of the code. Gates read these comments and thought, oh wow, this guy is so right. Now on the grid project, it definitely stung. For the first time, Gates realized that his brilliance had limits. But he also noticed this rigorous feedback and accountability could push him further than he could go on his own. And he began to shift. He started to shift from putting himself at the center to putting the work at the center. And he started to ask, what does perfect software look like anyhow? Now at Harvard, the myth of the lone genius cracked further. Gates had been one of the smartest kids in his hometown, but he was also a big fish in a small pond. Now here at Harvard, that was actually the biography of every single student. Every student was the best person at math they'd ever met. And now they're all in the same lecture hall, struggling in Math 55 together. There was so much more to learn than any of them had ever anticipated. Gates wasn't the standout anymore. And if pure brilliance didn't separate him from the pack, something else would have to. Paul Allen soon followed Gates to Boston to work at Honeywell. While he was there, Paul devoured computer magazines. He was always reading Popular Electronics or Datamation, or studying spec sheets for various computers and parts. He and Bill would nerd out about these things, and they noticed a theme. The microprocessor was becoming more accessible. And they were aware of Moore's law, which stated that the number of transistors on a chip would double every year. This meant that computers were getting more powerful on an exponential curve, and they wanted in. They first thought they should build a computer themselves, but they had built a computer with trafo data, and it was incredibly complex. It took capital, it took space, it took people to assemble, and when they invited potential clients to look at the trafo data computer, it broke. So they focused their ideas on software. As Bill put it, no wires, no factories. Writing software was just brain power and time. Now, in some of the techie stuff that follows, there's a lot of 8s in all these model numbers. There's an Intel 8008, an Intel 8080, and an Altair 8800. You probably don't need to worry about it all. I do have it straight, but I can imagine it's confusing. So in the trafo data computer, they used an Intel 8008, and they understood how to work with it. But when the Intel 8080 came out, they were jazzed by the specs. Bill told Paul to keep an eye out for someone who would develop a computer with an 8080 inside of it. Paul called him 3 months later to tell him about the Altair 8800. So the Altair 8800 has an Intel 8080 in it, which is an upgrade from the Intel 8008, which they had in their trafo data. Did you follow that? Okay, so now we're in the Altair 8800 with the Intel 8080 in it. Now, the Altair was missing a few things we take for granted today, most notably a keyboard, a screen, and any software. The only way to talk to the Altair was through 25 toggle switches in the front panels, and the only way to listen to it was through watching 36 blinking LEDs. So just to get the answer to 2 plus 2, a programmer had to first understand the commands, then convert it into binary, and then load these 5 lines of code by flipping switches dozens of times. It took about 10 minutes to get 2 plus 2, and even then, reading the answer requires the user to understand reading binary. A 4 in binary goes 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0. That'd just be these LEDs giving the answer in binary. But it could do the math. And here was the opportunity. Gates and Allen had a vision to put a computer on every desk in every home. But in order to do that, they need to make it more accessible. Now, Bill and Paul learned to program at Lakeside using an accessible language developed at Dartmouth College back in 1964 called BASIC. BASIC allowed programmers to type English-like commands, and those commands were converted into the machine language the language spoke. That conversion process is what's called an interpreter. Think of it like this. When you raise your arm, your brain sends an electrical pulse down your spinal cord to your muscles, causing them to contract. That's machine code. If someone asks you to raise your arm, they do it in a spoken language, like English or French or Chinese. You hear the words, your brain translates them into electrical pulses, and your arm moves. So the spoken language is like BASIC. The electrical pulses are like machine language, and your brain doing the translation is the interpreter. Now, each processor spoke its own machine language. A basic interpreter for one processor would not work on another. It's really just like an app for an iPhone doesn't run on an Android. Each platform needs its own version. So they made a bet that the Altair 8800 would take off, and they decided they should build an interpreter. They would call it Altair BASIC. But first, they called MITS, the maker of the Altair. They told the MITS president, Ed Roberts, they already had a BASIC for the Altair. Ed told him he had received many such calls, and the first to build it will get the order. So they were off to the races, and they did so without ever touching an Altair themselves. Now, as it turns out, both parties were hedging their bets. Gates and Allen had not yet built Altair BASIC, though they said they had, and MITS had also not yet built a fully working Altair 8800, although it was on the cover of Popular Electronics. In the Trafo data days, Paul figured out how to program that $1 million computer called the PDP-10 to pretend it was a $360 Intel 8008. So once again, Paul studied the manuals for the Altair and its new 8080 microprocessor, and he created an emulator on the PDP-10 at Harvard's Aiken lab, just like he'd done at CCC in the Trafo data days. And Bill started writing the code, which he ran on the emulator that Allen built. And he wrote the code for Altair BASIC. Now, Gates and Allen were very open. They would discuss their work wherever they were. They talked about it in the lab. They talked about it in the cafeteria. And one day, they were discussing the importance of handling floating point math. Big numbers need to be handled in a certain way, so decimals, I guess. And they also needed to be first to have a basic interpreter for the Altair. This was a race. But they were worried about the floating point math. This would be tedious, it would be time-consuming. But without it, a popular game like Lunar Lander, which they had learned to code at Lakeside, would just never work. Now there's another student at the table. He's a freshman math major from Wisconsin named Monte Davidoff, and he spoke up. He said, "I've done that." Gates quizzed him for hours. He was convinced and enthralled, and he brought him aboard. As Gates later admitted in source code, he says, "My view at the time was that advances in the world sprang from individuals. I pictured the proverbial lone genius, the solo scientist working tirelessly in their field, pushing themselves until they had a breakthrough. My solo scientist view of the world was grist for an on and off debate with Paul. He saw the world advancing through collaboration, in which teams of smart people pulled together towards a common goal. Where I saw Einstein as the model, he saw the Manhattan Project, which had like 180,000 people working on it. Both views were simplistic, though in time, his would define both of our futures." So Gates, Allen, and Davidoff worked on the BASIC, on the PDP-10 in Harvard's Aiken lab every night for 6 weeks. Finally, BASIC was running well enough to demo to MITS. Gates printed the code on a paper tape, handed it to Allen, and Paul Allen flew to MITS headquarters in Albuquerque. On the way, Allen actually realized they'd forgotten this thing called a bootstrapping loader, which tells the Altair to load the BASIC into memory so it'll actually work. So Paul wrote that on the plane, pencil and paper. He arrived in Albuquerque. MITS greeted him with an Altair 8080, the first he had ever seen. Paul programmed his bootstrap loader into the machine using the switches in the front panel, which took like 20 minutes. Then he loaded BASIC into the machine with the paper tape reader, which took about 7 minutes. And Paul sat at the teletype and typed, "print 2 + 2, and the teletype responded 4. As Gates put it, With that, the first piece of software written for the personal computer came to life. Ed Roberts, the MIT's president, exclaims, "Oh my God, it printed 4." He was surprised and pleased as Alan. Bill Yates, MIT's lead engineer, handed Alan a now classic book called 101 Basic Computer Games. Now, when I was a kid in the 80s, quick aside, when I was a kid in the 80s, I actually learned how to code in BASIC. And this is how I learned how to code in BASIC as well. My dad had a magazine with computer games in it, the code for computer games. And that's how we did it. We would take the code, type it into our TRS-80, and then we'd have to debug it. But then we get to play a video game. It was amazing. And this is the same thing that Paul Allen's doing. So Paul turns to the page that has a version of the lunar lander in it. He types it in, and it works perfectly. Now remember, that's demonstrating Monte's floating point module. That was why they wanted it in there so badly, so that people could play lunar lander. The product that put Microsoft on the map didn't come from Gates alone. It came from collaboration. Paul Allen built the emulator. Davidoff wrote the floating point math. And without this, Bill Gates' Altair BASIC would never have worked. Allen's model of a team collaborating beat Gates' model of a lone genius. From there, Microsoft scaled quickly. Just 2 years later, in 1977, when Gates was just 22 years old, they landed the jobs for the BASIC interpreter on the Radio Shack TRS-80, which I had as a kid, the Commodore PET 2001, and the Apple II. I was really surprised in my research to see Apple on this list. Turns out Gates called Steve Jobs, and Jobs replied that they already had a BASIC. It was written by Steve Wozniak. But guess what? Wozniak's BASIC didn't have the floating point module. It was Monte Davidoff's contribution that sealed the deal with Apple. And the Apple II sold 6 million machines. In 1986, Microsoft went public. And by the year 2000, the company had grown so explosively that an estimated 10,000 employees became millionaires through their stock options. Think about that. 10,000 millionaires. And in the year 2000, they had 39,000 employees. Now, that kind of scale doesn't come from one genius coding alone. It comes from building a massive team of teams, each united around a common purpose, each communicating about the things that are relevant to communicate about in order to deliver on that scale. Now, years later, I remember this was in 2020. I remember when I first heard this podcast because I was in Montreal during COVID and I was on a run. And Gates was on Dax Shepard's podcast called The Armchair Expert. And he said he once believed in the lone genius myth, but experience taught him otherwise. Here's the clip.
I have to imagine for me as a control freak, the very hardest thing that you must have had to eventually do is learn to delegate. Was that one of the bigger challenges for you in Microsoft?
Yeah, and that's a kind of scaling that is a huge challenge. So at first I wrote all the code. Then I hired all the people who wrote the code and I looked at the code. Then eventually there was code that I didn't look at or people that I didn't hire. And of course, the average quality per person is kind of going down. But the ability to have big impact is going up. And so that idea that a large company is imperfect in many ways, and yet it's the way to get out to the entire world and bring in all these mix of skills, most people don't make that transition. And, there are times where you go, oh my God, I just want to write the code myself. The famous thing I'd always say is, I could have come in and written that over the weekend. Well, eventually I couldn't. The individual contributor and the orchestrating an organization, those aren't often found together because there's a certain contradiction to that craftsman.
The shift was complete. The boy who thought he could do it all alone became the leader who built an empire of teams, a company of 228,000 people today. Gates admitted it himself. The hardest shift he ever made was moving from being a craftsman who could do everything himself to orchestrating an organization that could reach the world. That's the same shift every new leader must make. And every job you have from now on is a manager job. A CEO is a manager, just like a first-line leader. Make the shift now while the stakes are still low. Bill Gates' story mimics the arc that every new leader faces. We start by relying on our own skills because that's what got us here. But the real shift is moving from solo brilliance to building and trusting teams. Solo brilliance does spark invention, but teams sustain it. So let me ask you, when was your humbling moment? The one that showed you couldn't do it alone? What were the hardest bits? It took me years to build my framework. Getting aligned on a common goal, having transparent processes that facilitate focus and execution. Psychological safety that took me so long to understand, but now it's so easy. And cohesion with the team, which facilitates trust. If you want more leadership lessons told through real stories, hit subscribe. I've got more coming soon. Until then, thanks for listening to the Leadership Lighthouse podcast. I'm Evan Hickok, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.